Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Growth in Time to Eternity.
Martin Israel. The Reverend Dr. Martin Israel was president of the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. This article appeared in the June 1989 edition of the Christian Parapsychologist Journal, and may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. William Wordsworth in his ode, Intimations of Immortality, says that our birth is simply a sleep in which we forget the past, but in fact our soul has had a previous period of experience and decline, coming from a far country. And yet the oblivion is not total, nor is the soul entirely without form. It comes trailing clouds of glory from God who is our home. He goes on to trace the heavenly awareness of infancy as it gradually diminishes during childhood to be finally blotted out after adolescence. Then we all have to assume the burden of full adult responsibility in a world of cut and thrust. If we do not take care of our own interests primarily, there is unlikely to be anyone else to assist us. Later on, family responsibilities encroach further into our life, so that we are hemmed in by the heavy atmosphere of expediency which we take for granted as the sum total of reality. All this seems very sad, and I, for one, accept Wordsworth's view of the soul's pre-existence without qualification. But, were it not for the stringencies of daily life, we would not grow. We have indeed to make friends with the mammon of unrighteousness. Filthy lucre or worldly wealth would be a more contemporary expression, using all the gifts and talents God has left us, so that we may effect as successful an existence in this world as is commensurate with our personalities. Success, while not to be measured in purely materialistic terms, is nevertheless closely related to the contribution we have made to the community around us. It may be outer achievement, and there is nothing to feel ashamed about in the acquisition of wealth and power, provided it is used responsibly and stewarded carefully, remembering that none of us can cling onto material objects forever, but much more important is the enrichment our lives have made to those around us. We usually have to fail materially before we can discover the soul deep within us that came into this incarnation trailing clouds of glory from on high. It seems to have been so overlaid with the world's shabby values that its inner radiance was permanently tarnished and its substance made shoddy and unrefined. But all the time it was learning some valuable lessons about responsibility, suffering, and sacrifice that were quite foreign to it at its moment of conception. In fact, this is probably a superficial judgment, for in the soul's depths were areas of deep compassion that were present long before adult life was attained. What exactly is the soul? It is alternatively described as the true self or the inner being. Its action is the will, freed from all outer conditioning, and its manifestation is the inner life. It shows itself especially when decisions of moral urgency have to be made. What does it profit a man if he gain the whole world at the cost of his true self? Asks Jesus in Mark 8:36. What part of a man then can so gain the whole world? It is the outer concretization of the personality which we call the ego. This is what we present to the world, being, as it were, the emotional and rational force behind the action of the physical body. Until the ego is well formed, we cannot perform our life's work adequately. We may be full of good intentions, but outwardly we will show a wimpish indecisiveness that will irritate rather than assist others. We will tend to let other people down in emergencies and be a general nuisance. I say all this advisedly because the ego is generally given a poor press in spiritual circles. Does not Jesus himself say, just before the text already quoted, "Whoever cares for his own safety is lost, but if a man will be lost for my sake and for the gospel, that man is safe"? Mark 8:35. The safety here mentioned is the ego consciousness that seeks for its own reward and safety irrespective of the needs of other people. It is clear that there comes a time when that ego strength has to be sacrificed in the cause of truth, whether moral, aesthetic, or philanthropic. Then the person is thrown to the wolves. But in dying to his old self, the real self unfolds, and the soul reveals itself in its newly found glory, no longer merely pristine as at the time of birth but now experienced in the field of life. Therefore, the importance of worldly experience lies in its effect in the building up of the whole personality focused on the point of the ego, so that when the moment of trial comes it may be found worthy of sacrifice to God. And then the soul shows itself in its full glory. But what actually happens to the ego that is sacrificed? It is taken up into the glory of the soul. In a perfectly functioning individual, of whom Jesus is the supreme exemplar, ego and soul are perpetually in correspondence, so that the ego is the outer manifestation of the soul. In Jesus, furthermore, the spirit, the deepest and holiest point of the soul where God dwells, has expanded to take in the entire soul substance. So therefore the fourth gospel is soundly based when it says that anyone who has seen Jesus has seen the Father, John 14:9. In the lives of very ordinary times people there can be a moment of expanded consciousness when that individual is prepared to make the supreme sacrifice, and then we can see something of Christ in him also. The martyrdom of Stephen is an example of this transfiguration, Acts 7:55-56. It is this principle, the soul, that is destined for survival after the physical body disintegrates. It is surely active even when the body seems an inert piece of living furniture, as in the tragedy of dementia. The question arises as to the obvious inequality of soul structure. For a long time, people have spoken of an old soul in respect of an individual, often remarkably young in years, who seems to have an exceptional knowledge of the things of eternity. His siblings may be quite normal in their reactions to the world, hedonistic and protectively self-centered, but he somehow has moved beyond concern for such things, and his gaze is centered on the divine reality only. He is naturally religious, but soon his understanding surpasses that of the authorities of his faith, and he is forced out of the fold to explore new fields of truth. A not entirely dissimilar circumstance is the occasional genius who outstrips his contemporaries and teachers alike in the excellence of his performance at an incredibly early age. The fields of music and mathematics are especially notable areas of stupendous child prodigies. Could these have had souls? Indeed, one could almost say, are they souls, with much previous experience in a life before birth? We cannot give a firm opinion at present, but my own judgment leads me to attribute much of childhood genius, like childhood mental defect, dyslexia, and autism, to genetic mechanisms. The criterion is what the genius ultimately amounts to on a higher spiritual plane. The supreme musical genius, Mozart, grew in proficiency, and his later compositions cannot but touch the deepest spiritual core in any sensitive listener. Admittedly, the composer himself was not an especially spiritual man in his private life, but was the medium for something so phenomenal that the perspective of the civilized world has been altered by his glorious music. In the instance of spiritual geniuses whose nature is the old soul, who even in youth seemed fully acquainted with heavenly things, in this respect we remember Jesus conversing with the doctors of law in the temple at Jerusalem when he was only 12 years old. It could be that the matter is somewhat different. I am less happy about spiritual understanding being a genetic commodity because it is so intimately involved in spontaneous relationships with other people as well as with God. In other words, it is not a mere skill like music or mathematics, but a chosen way of life. We hear a great deal about the born-again Christians. Their conversion seems to me often to have a strongly emotional element to it, so that they tend to become judgmental against those with whom they disagree, seeing in these other people's descent a seed of evil, usually termed the enemy, alias Satan. This narrow approach is found in the fundamentalist faction of the other great religious traditions also, and is not a specifically Christian phenomenon. The much more healthy once-born Christian, of whom Jesus himself is the great example, is truly centered on God whose nature he knows as love, not merely with the intellect but with the soul that radiates this knowledge through the entire personality. He is not a persecutor and is not especially frightened of evil, though, of course, being sensibly aware of its danger. He, however, looks for the final conversion of evil to good rather than its dramatic destruction in bloody spiritual warfare. Needless to say, he is often not especially popular with the religious masses, but he has learned the great lesson of loving one's enemies and praying for one's persecutors. The born-again religionist longs for martyrdom, which in fact boosts his ego, whereas the firstborn individual longs only for peace to come to the world. Not infrequently he does die a martyr's death, sometimes even at the hands of the religious establishment. Jesus' end is a classic exposition of the theme. On other occasions his death is a manifestation of love for the downtrodden and oppressed, but hatred is not a feature of his end. I believe that such a person is the best evidence we at present have for the belief in the pre-existence of the soul, controversial as that evidence may be. The other source of evidence is the memories of some young children of other times and places that could not have been discovered from their present situations. Professor Ian Stevenson is especially remembered in relation to the systematic collection of these cases and their analysis. Most cases occur in societies that are sympathetic to the hypothesis of rebirth, which is not surprising, because a dogmatically hostile environment, whether humanistic or religious, and here I allude to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in their traditional formulations, especially in fundamentalist circles, would soon dampen the child's memories. He might either be regarded as just naughty or else mentally disturbed. On the other hand, rebirth sympathizers might purposefully encourage the child's memories, which could then be eked out with fraud and pure fantasy. The phenomenon of prenatal, indeed preconceptual, memory seems to be valid, but what it means is still to be elucidated. It could be a resonance with the general psychic environment of a past epoch, but the specificity of some of the details suggests something more significant than this. One thing seems certain: the fundamental beliefs of the research workers heavily color their deductions, a fact only too obvious in parapsychology generally. I personally favor the hypotheses of pre-existence and rebirth. The one almost inevitably follows the other, except in those rare cases where a soul is so advanced that it goes back permanently to God, who is our home. In fact, I believe we are all perpetually about God's business, like the 12-year-old Jesus, but infinitely less efficiently. Heaven is to be about that business in complete dedication, so that the ego is working under the full direction of the soul, which in turn is inspired by the Holy Spirit immanent in its own spirit. Hell is to be in complete egoistic isolation from God and our fellow creatures. The advanced soul knows this from much past experience. The golden rule of doing to others as you would have them do to you takes many experiences to understand, so separated are we from the source of our own being. The spiritual genius comes in with this knowledge, and his work is to teach it to the world. The stories of Jeremiah and Jesus show how grateful the world usually is. Even such a figure as the Buddha, who was revered in BIS' own lifetime, still strains for the deeper teaching to penetrate the lives of his followers. As Amos wrote a long time ago, ritual observances get one nowhere until one's whole heart is dedicated to God in proper living. Once we can see the scheme of pre-existence and rebirth, whether here or elsewhere, is of little moment in our present situation, as a way of growth into the knowledge and love of God, we can live more diligently now, agreeing with St. Paul that the sufferings we now endure bear no comparison with the splendor, as yet unrevealed, which is in store for us. Romans 8:18. The Christian will grow in the full knowledge of his Savior, a far more massive figure than the personality worshipped by the masses. Indeed, they will have to die to him before they can see who he really is.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.